April 29th, 1945. The smell hit them first. Private Robert Sullivan would later say it was like nothing he'd ever experienced. A thick, sweet rot that clung to the back of your throat and made your eyes water. It wasn't just the smell of death, though. That was certainly part of it. It was the smell of decay, of human waste, of disease, of suffering concentrated into an odor so powerful it seemed to have physical weight. The men of the 45th Infantry Division had been fighting since Sicily, through the beaches of Salerno, up the boot of Italy, through the frozen forests of France, across the killing fields of the Ardennes, but nothing in 2 years of continuous combat prepared them for what waited behind the gates of Dachau concentration camp. Bob was 23 years old from a small farming town in Ohio called Millfield, where the biggest tragedy he'd known before the war was his grandfather's death from pneumonia when Bob was 12. He'd enlisted right after Pearl Harbor, full of that clean American certainty that they were fighting the good fight, that the Nazis were evil and needed to be stopped, that freedom and democracy would triumph. By April 1945, that certainty had been ground down by mud and blood and the faces of dead friends, worn thin by months of seeing what men could do to each other, but it was still there, buried deep under layers of exhaustion and trauma. Dachau would bury it deeper, would bury it so deep that Bob would spend the next 40 years trying to dig it back out. The division had been pushing through Bavaria for weeks, moving fast now as the German army collapsed, encountering less organized resistance but more desperate pockets of SS fanatics who'd rather die than surrender. Rumors had been spreading through the ranks about camps, about places where the Nazis had imprisoned and murdered civilians, Jews, political prisoners, anyone they deemed undesirable or threatening to their twisted vision of racial purity. Some guys didn't believe it. Propaganda, they said. Exaggeration meant to keep us angry and fighting. The Jews couldn't have it that bad. Bob had heard the stories from intelligence officers who'd interviewed refugees and resistance fighters. He'd seen the fear in the eyes of liberated French and Belgian villagers when they spoke in hushed tones about the deportations, about neighbors taken away in the night, never to return. But even he couldn't quite picture it, couldn't make his mind accept what the reports were saying. How do you picture systematic murder on an industrial scale when you've only ever known the simple rhythms of Ohio farm life, of Friday night football games and Sunday church services and the county fair in August? They approached the camp in the late morning, the spring sun bright and warm, birds singing in the trees lining the road, nature oblivious to what man had created here. The stench grew stronger with every step, and some of the men pulled their neckerchiefs up over their noses, but it didn't help much. Then they saw the train, 39 boxcars sitting on a siding near the camp entrance, and in those boxcars were bodies. Not just a few, not a dozen, hundreds upon hundreds, maybe thousands in total, piled on top of each other like cordwood, like garbage, skeletal figures in filthy striped uniforms, their faces frozen in expressions of agony and desperation and disbelief. Some of the men had clearly tried to claw their way out through the wooden walls. Bob saw fingernails torn off and left bloody marks on the wood, saw where desperate hands had scratched and pounded until there was no strength left. These people had been locked in these cars without food, without water, without air, and left to die of starvation and thirst and suffocation. The train had been sitting there for days, maybe a week, the SS guards having fled as the Americans approached, leaving their victims to rot in the spring sunshine. Private Jimmy Chen from San Francisco, a tough kid who'd fought his way through Italy and never complained, vomited right there on the tracks, his breakfast coming up in violent heaves. Sergeant Mike O'Connor, a hard-bitten Irishman from Boston who'd been in the Army since 1942 and had fought through every major engagement from Salerno to the Bulge, a man who'd seen his best friend cut in half by machine gun fire and kept fighting, just stood there with tears running down his weathered face, his rifle hanging loose in his hands. Bob felt his own hands shaking, felt something cold and dark settling into his chest like a stone, something that would never quite leave. They were soldiers. They'd seen death in all its forms. They'd seen men blown apart by artillery, burned alive in tanks, frozen to death in foxholes, drowned in rivers, shot, stabbed, crushed. But this wasn't death in combat. This wasn't soldiers fighting soldiers. This was murder. This was evil. This was something else entirely. Something that made the war they'd been fighting seem almost clean by comparison. Lieutenant Felix Sparks, their battalion commander, A lean, tough officer from Arizona who'd risen through the ranks and earned the respect of every man in the unit, was already inside the camp perimeter with an advance squad. Bob's unit followed, moving like men in a dream or a nightmare, their training and discipline carrying them forward, even as their minds struggled to process what they were seeing. The main gate stood open, the iron words, Arbeit macht frei, mocking them from above. Work sets you free, the infamous lie of the concentration camps. Inside, the scene was apocalyptic, like something from the Book of Revelation. Prisoners in filthy, lice-infested striped uniforms wandered between the long wooden barracks. So thin they looked like walking skeletons, like animated corpses, their skin stretched tight over bones, their eyes huge and hollow in sunken faces. Some could barely stand, leaning against buildings or each other for support. Others lay in the mud of the roll call square, too weak to move, too weak even to call out for help. Bob watched one man, probably in his 30s but looking 70, try to walk toward them with his arms outstretched, a smile of desperate joy on his ravaged face, and collapse after 3 steps. The man just lay there in the mud, breathing in shallow gasps, staring at the sky with those enormous eyes, and Bob didn't know if he was dying or just resting, or if there was any difference anymore. The barracks were worse, if worse was even possible at this point. Wooden bunks stacked 3 high, packed with men who were more dead than alive, lying in their own filth because they were too weak to move, some of them already dead, and the living too exhausted to push the corpses away. The smell of disease and human waste and death was overwhelming, making the air thick and hard to breathe. Bob saw a man who couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds, nothing but skin stretched over a skeleton, trying to smile at him with broken teeth, trying to say something in a language Bob didn't understand, maybe German, maybe Polish, maybe Yiddish. The man's hand reached out, trembling, and Bob took it, felt the bones through the papery skin, felt the man squeeze with what little strength he had left. Bob wanted to help, wanted to do something, wanted to fix this somehow, but what do you do? How do you fix this? How do you undo months or years of systematic starvation and torture and degradation? Near the crematoria, there were piles of bodies, not buried, not covered with sheets or tarps, not treated with any dignity or care, just piled up like garbage waiting to be burned, naked and twisted and obscene in death. Some of the bodies were still smoldering in the ovens, the SS having been running the crematoria right up until the Americans arrived, trying to destroy the evidence of their crimes. Bob counted at least 50 corpses in one pile alone, maybe more. It was hard to tell where one body ended and another began. Their faces, their hands, the way they'd been thrown there without any dignity or care or recognition of their humanity. These had been people. Someone's father, someone's son, someone's brother, someone's husband. They'd had names and lives and dreams and families. Now they were just bodies in a pile, waiting to be burned and forgotten. And then Bob saw the SS guards. About 50 of them had been captured by advance units and were being held in a courtyard near the coal yard, their hands behind their heads, or up in the air in surrender. They stood there in their black uniforms with the silver SS runes and death's head insignia, some with their hands up, some just standing at attention like they were waiting for inspection, like this was just another day in the army. A few looked scared, their eyes darting around, clearly understanding that they were in serious danger. Most looked arrogant, defiant, their chins up and their eyes cold, like they were proud of what they'd done, like they'd just been following orders and doing their duty. One of them, a young guy maybe Bob's age with blonde hair and ice blue eyes and the kind of Aryan features the Nazis loved, was actually smirking, his lips curled in a contemptuous smile, actually smirking. Like this was all some kind of joke, like the corpses and the skeletal prisoners and the ovens and the train full of dead bodies were just part of a day's work. Nothing to be ashamed of, maybe even something to be proud of. Something snapped. Bob didn't know if it was in him or in the men around him or in all of them at once. A collective breaking point reached after seeing too much horror in too short a time. Someone fired. Bob never knew who fired first. Maybe it was Jimmy Chen, still wiping vomit from his mouth. Maybe it was Mike O'Connor, tears still wet on his face. Maybe it was Bob himself, though he didn't think so. Then someone else fired. Then it was everyone. The whole unit opening up with M1 Garands and carbines and Thompson submachine guns. The courtyard erupting in gunfire. The SS guards fell, some trying to run, some throwing themselves to the ground, some just standing there taking the bullets like they knew this was coming, and had accepted it. Bob raised his M1 Garand, the rifle that had been his constant companion for 2 years, and fired. Once, twice, 3 times. He watched the blonde guard with the smirk drop to his knees, the arrogance draining from his face along with his blood, his eyes going wide with shock and pain and fear. Bob fired again deliberately, aiming, making sure. The man fell forward into the mud of the courtyard, his perfect Aryan features pressed into the dirt. It took maybe 30 seconds. When it was over, the courtyard was silent except for the ringing in their ears from the gunfire and the moans of the wounded SS men who weren't quite dead yet. Lieutenant Sparks came running from another part of the camp, shouting for them to cease fire, to hold their positions, to maintain discipline. His face was red with anger and maybe something else, maybe understanding, maybe his own rage barely controlled. Some of the men looked ashamed, their eyes down, unable to meet Sparks's gaze. Some looked defiant, their jaws set, daring anyone to criticize what they'd just done. Bob just felt empty, hollowed out like something essential had been scooped out of his chest and left a void behind. Later, there would be an investigation. The Army couldn't just ignore the summary execution of 50 prisoners of war, even if those prisoners were SS guards who'd been running a death camp. Statements would be taken from dozens of soldiers. Some men would claim they'd been fired upon first by the SS guards, that it was self-defense. Others would say the prisoners had attacked the guards, and they'd been caught in the crossfire trying to protect the inmates. Still others would claim they didn't remember, that everything was confused and chaotic. The official reports would be contradictory, confused, impossible to reconcile into a single coherent narrative. General George Patton himself, the legendary commander of the Third Army, would eventually review the case and shut down the inquiry, writing in his typically blunt style that he wouldn't have American soldiers tried and punished for killing the enemy, especially an enemy as vile as the SS. The investigation would be quietly buried, the files sealed. But Bob knew the truth. They all knew the truth. They'd executed those SS guards. Not in combat, not in self-defense, not in any way that could be justified under the rules of war or military law. They'd killed them because of what they'd seen, because of the rage and horror and helplessness that had built up to an unbearable pressure and had nowhere else to go but out through the barrels of their rifles. In the days after Dachau, Bob barely spoke. The division moved on, pushing deeper into Germany as the Reich collapsed, encountering surrendering Wehrmacht units and displaced persons wandering the roads and towns full of Germans who claimed they'd never supported Hitler and had no idea what had been happening in the camps. But something had changed in the men who'd been at Dachau. The usual jokes and banter were gone. The card games and bull sessions were quieter, more subdued. At night, men would wake up screaming, their tent mates shaking them awake, telling them it was just a dream, even though they all knew it wasn't just a dream. It was a memory. Bob started having nightmares about the train, about opening those boxcar doors over and finding more bodies, an endless supply of the dead, corpses spilling out like a flood. He dreamed about the blonde SS guard, about the way his expression had changed in the moment before he died, the smirk replaced by shock and fear. Sometimes in the dreams, the guard had Bob's face. Sometimes Bob was the one in the black uniform, standing in the courtyard waiting for the bullets. Sometimes Bob was in the striped uniform, starving and dying, and the guards had the faces of his friends from back home. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, just 9 days after the liberation of Dachau. Bob was in a small Bavarian town whose name he never remembered when they got the news. Everyone was celebrating, drinking liberated German beer and schnapps, dancing with local girls who suddenly claimed they'd never supported the Nazis and had always hoped the Americans would come. Guys were firing their weapons in the air, singing, laughing, crying with relief that they'd survived. Bob sat alone in a barn on the edge of town, cleaning his rifle for the 100th time even though it was already spotless, trying not to think about Dachau, trying not to see those faces every time he closed his eyes. The dead in the train, the living dead in the barracks, the SS guards in the courtyard, his own face in a piece of broken mirror that morning, looking like a stranger, looking like someone he didn't recognize and wasn't sure he wanted to know. He came home in late 1945, processed through a demobilization center in New Jersey, given his discharge papers and a small amount of back pay and a handshake and a thanks for your service. His mother cried when she saw him at the train station in Millfield, threw her arms around him and sobbed into his shoulder. His father shook his hand firmly and called him a hero, pride shining in his eyes. His younger sister, who'd been 15 when he left and was now 17, looked at him with a mix of admiration and uncertainty, like she wasn't quite sure who this man was. The town threw a parade down Main Street, all 4 blocks of it, with a high school band and bunting and people waving flags. Bob rode in a convertible with 2 other veterans from Millfield, smiled and waved and said all the right things. "How are you, Bob?" "Fine, thanks. Good to be home." "What was it like over there?" "Tough, but we got through it, did what we had to do." "Did you see any action?" "Some. Yeah, here and there." "Did you kill any Nazis?" That question always made him pause, made something twist in his gut. "Yeah," he'd say. "Yeah, I did." He met a girl named Helen at a church social in the spring of 1946. She was pretty, with dark hair and kind eyes, and she worked as a secretary at the county courthouse. She was smart and funny and didn't ask too many questions about the war, seemed to understand that there were things he didn't want to talk about. They courted for a year, going to movies and church socials and the county fair, and Bob felt something like normal returning to his life, felt like maybe he could build a future, could be the person he'd been before Dachau. They were married in June 1947 in the same church where Bob had been baptized as a baby. Sarah was born in April 1950, a healthy baby girl with Helen's dark hair and Bob's blue eyes. Michael came along in August 1953, a sturdy boy who rarely cried. Bob got a job at the plant that made auto parts, started on the line, and worked his way up to foreman. He bought a house with a GI loan, a modest 3-bedroom with a yard where the kids could play. He mowed the lawn on Saturdays, went to church on Sundays, helped with homework, showed up to PTA meetings. He was living the American dream, the life he'd fought for, the life all those men had died for. He should have been happy. He should have been grateful. He should have been at peace. But Dachau never left him. It was there in the quiet moments, in the space between sleep and waking and the pause between one breath and the next. It was there when he looked at his children playing in the yard and thought about the children who'd died in that camp, about the babies and toddlers who'd been gassed or shot or starved. It was there when he lost his temper over small things, snapping at Helen for some minor household issue and then immediately feeling guilty and apologizing. It was there when Helen would find him sitting in the dark living room at 3 a.m, unable to sleep, staring at nothing. It was there when he couldn't explain why he couldn't go to the 4th of July fireworks, because the sounds of explosions made his hands shake and his heart race and brought back memories of artillery barrages and gunfire. It was there in the way he sometimes zoned out during conversations, his mind somewhere else, somewhere dark. It was there in the nightmares that came 2 or 3 times a week that had him waking up gasping and sweating. Helen's hand on his shoulder, her voice soft and worried, asking if he was okay. The kids learned not to ask about the war. Dad fought in Europe. Dad was in the 45th Infantry Division. Dad helped liberate a concentration camp. That was all they needed to know, all they were told. Sarah, curious and sensitive, even as a little girl, would sometimes try to push a little further. "What was the camp like, Dad? What did you see there? Were the people okay?" Bob would get a distant look in his eyes, his jaw would tighten, and he'd say, "It was bad, honey. Real bad. People suffered. But we helped them. That's what matters." Then he'd change the subject or find an excuse to leave the room, to go work in the garage or mow the lawn or do anything other than talk about Dachau. Michael, more pragmatic and less curious than his sister, learned to read the signs early. When Dad got that look on his face, you left him alone. When his voice got quiet and flat, you didn't push. When he went to sit in the garage by himself, you didn't follow. There were good times, too, plenty of them. Bob taught them to fish in the creek that ran through the woods outside town, showed them how to bait a hook and cast a line and be patient. He helped with homework every night, sitting at the kitchen table and working through math problems and spelling words. He showed up to every school play and baseball game and piano recital, camera in hand, pride on his face. He took them camping in the summer, taught them to identify birds and trees, told them stories about growing up on the farm. He was a good father, but there was always a shadow, a part of him that was somewhere else, somewhere they couldn't reach, a locked room in his soul that he'd never let anyone enter. Helen knew more than the kids, but even she didn't know everything. Bob had told her about Dachau, about the bodies and the prisoners and the horror of it all. Late one night early in their marriage when the nightmares had been particularly bad, and she demanded to know what was wrong, what was haunting him. He'd told her about the train full of corpses, about the skeletal prisoners, about the piles of bodies near the crematoria. He'd cried in her arms, something he'd never done in front of anyone else, and she'd held him and told him it wasn't his fault, that he'd done what he could, that he was a good man. But he'd never told her about the courtyard, about the executions, about raising his rifle and deliberately, consciously killing a man who'd surrendered, who was a prisoner, who should have been protected under the laws of war. That was his burden alone, his secret, the thing he couldn't share even with the woman he loved most in the world. The years passed with the steady, relentless pace of ordinary life. The 1950s gave way to the 1960s. The kids grew up. Sarah went to college, became a teacher. Michael studied engineering. Bob watched the Vietnam War on television and felt a complicated mix of emotions he couldn't quite articulate. He saw young men coming home to protests and anger, saw them spat on and called baby killers, and part of him was horrified by how they were treated. But another part of him, a part he was ashamed of, envied them for being able to talk about it, for having their trauma acknowledged even if it wasn't understood or appreciated. His war had been the good war, the necessary war, the war against pure evil. You didn't complain about the good war. You didn't talk about the dark parts, the morally ambiguous parts, the parts that kept you up at night. You were supposed to be grateful you'd survived and proud of what you'd accomplished and move on with your life. So that's what he did. He moved on. Or at least he pretended to, put on a good enough show that most people believed it. In 1975, on the 30th anniversary of VE Day, PBS ran a special documentary about the liberation of the concentration camps. Bob watched it alone in the living room after everyone had gone to bed, unable to look away even though every image was like a knife in his chest. They showed footage of Dachau, actual film shot by army cameramen in the days after liberation. The train, the barracks, the prisoners, the bodies. Bob sat there in the flickering light of the television with tears running down his face, unable to look away, unable to breathe properly. When Helen came down and found him, drawn by some instinct that something was wrong, he couldn't speak. He just held her and shook, his whole body trembling like he was having a seizure. The next morning he was quiet at breakfast, moving through the routine mechanically. Sarah, home from her teaching job for the weekend, asked if he was okay. "I'm fine," he said automatically. "Just tired. Didn't sleep well." But Sarah saw something in his eyes that scared her, a depth of pain and haunting that she'd never seen before, that made her realize there were things about her father she didn't know, wounds that had never healed. The 1980s brought changes. Bob retired from the plant in 1983 at age 61, taking early retirement with a modest pension. The kids were grown and independent now. Sarah was married with 2 children of her own. Michael had a good job with an engineering firm in Cleveland. Bob and Helen were grandparents, a role Bob loved and threw himself into, finding a kind of redemption in his grandchildren's innocent joy. But retirement also meant more time to think, which wasn't always a good thing. Without the structure and distraction of work, the memories came more frequently. He started having more nightmares, more frequent and more vivid. The blonde SS guard appeared almost nightly now, sometimes accusing, sometimes just staring with those cold blue eyes, sometimes speaking in German that Bob didn't understand but somehow knew was important. Bob would wake up gasping, his heart pounding, Helen's hand on his shoulder, her voice soft and worried. "It's okay," she'd say. "You're home. You're safe." But he didn't feel safe. He felt like a man living on borrowed time, like the bill for what he'd done was coming due, like judgment was approaching, and he'd have to account for his actions. In February 1985, Bob got a letter from the 45th Infantry Division Association. They were organizing a 40th anniversary reunion in Oklahoma City in June, and there would be a special ceremony honoring the liberation of Dachau and the other camps. Bob stared at that letter for a long time, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee growing cold. He hadn't been to a reunion in years, maybe a decade, hadn't wanted to face the other men, to see in their eyes the same things he saw in his own every morning in the mirror, hadn't wanted to talk about it, to dredge up memories that he spent most of his energy trying to suppress. But 40 years, 4 decades since that April day, almost as long after Dachau as his entire life before it. Maybe it was time. Maybe he needed to go back, not to Germany, but to that moment, to face it with the men who'd been there, who'd seen what he'd seen, who'd done what he'd done. He told Helen he was thinking about going. She looked at him carefully, reading his face the way she'd learned to do over 38 years of marriage. It might help, she said. It might give you some peace, or at least some company in your pain. Bob nodded. Maybe, he said. Maybe. The reunion was in June, in a hotel in Oklahoma City. Bob drove there alone, telling Helen he needed the time to think, needed the long hours on the road to prepare himself. The drive took 2 days, and Bob spent most of it in his own head, memories playing like a film reel he couldn't shut off. The gathering was smaller than he'd expected. A lot of the guys were dead. Heart attacks, cancer, car accidents, suicides. War kills you in a lot of ways, some of them slow, some of them delayed by decades. But there were still maybe 200 men there, gray-haired and thick around the middle, wearing jackets with division patches and medals, name tags with their rank and unit. Bob recognized some faces, older and heavier but still familiar. Jimmy Chen was there, looking prosperous and healthy, running a successful restaurant in San Francisco. Mike O'Connor came over and gave him a bear hug, still strong despite being in his 60s. They talked about safe things at first, the way veterans do. Families, jobs, health problems, grandkids, the weather, sports, anything but the war, anything but Dachau. But on the second night, after the formal dinner and speeches, after a few drinks had loosened tongues and lowered defenses, the story started. Someone mentioned the train. Someone else talked about the prisoners, about trying to feed them and making them sicker because their bodies couldn't handle real food anymore, about watching men die from kindness. Then Lieutenant Sparks, now a retired brigadier general, stood up to speak. He was in his mid-60s, still straight-backed and commanding, his voice still carrying that note of authority. He talked about the liberation, about the horror they'd witnessed, about the courage of the men who'd freed the camps and borne witness to evil. Then he paused. His voice got quieter, less certain. He talked about the incident in the courtyard, about the executions. He didn't use that word exactly, but everyone knew what he meant. He said that what happened that day was understandable, that any man who'd seen what they'd seen would have struggled to maintain discipline, that the SS guards had gotten what they deserved. But he also said that it had haunted him for 40 years, that he'd spent 4 decades wondering if he should have done more to stop it, if he'd failed as a commander, or if stopping it would have been wrong given what those SS bastards had done, given what they'd been part of. The room was silent. 200 men, and you could have heard a pin drop. Some stared at their drinks. Some looked at the floor. Some were crying openly, tears running down weathered faces. Bob felt something break open inside him, like a dam that had been holding back 40 years of pressure suddenly cracking. He stood up, his legs shaky, his heart pounding, and he said, his voice rough and barely above a whisper but carrying in that silent room, "I was there, in the courtyard. I fired my weapon. I killed at least one of them. Maybe more, I don't know. It happened so fast, but I know I killed that blonde kid with the smirk. I aimed. I fired. I watched him die. And I've carried it for 40 years. I've never told anyone, not my wife, not my kids, not my priest. But I need to say it. I need someone to know. I need to stop carrying it alone." The men around him nodded. Some reached out to touch his shoulder, his arm, offering silent support and understanding. Jimmy Chen said, his voice thick, "We all did what we did, Bob. Every man in that courtyard made a choice. We can't change it. We can only live with it. And maybe, after 40 years, we can stop pretending it didn't happen." Mike O'Connor said, "Those bastards deserved what they got. I won't apologize for it. I won't feel guilty. They were monsters." But Bob wasn't sure he agreed, wasn't sure it was that simple. Monsters are easy to kill. It's killing men, even evil men, even men who've done monstrous things, that haunts you. Because once you cross that line, once you kill someone who's surrendered, who's helpless, you can't pretend you're different from them anymore. You're just another killer. Maybe a justified killer, maybe a righteous killer, but still a killer. He drove home in a daze, the long hours on the road passing in a blur. When he got back to Ohio, Helen knew immediately that something had changed. He was quieter than usual, more distant, but also somehow lighter, like he'd put down a weight he'd been carrying. She asked what had happened at the reunion. He looked at her for a long moment, This woman who'd stood by him for 38 years, who'd held him through nightmares and tolerated his silences and loved him despite the broken parts. He said, "I need to tell you something. I need to tell the kids something. Something I should have told you all 40 years ago, but I don't know how. I don't know if I can find the words." Helen took his hand and said, "Just tell the truth. That's all you can ever do. Just tell the truth, and trust that we love you enough to handle it." So Bob decided he would. He'd tell them everything. What he'd seen. What he'd done. What he'd carried. He called Sarah and Michael and asked them to come over for dinner that weekend. Said he had something important to discuss, something he needed to tell them. Something in his tone, some unusual gravity, made them agree immediately without asking questions. Sarah drove down from Columbus, where she was teaching. Michael drove over from Cleveland. They arrived on Saturday afternoon, and both of them noticed immediately that something was different about their father. Some change in his demeanor they couldn't quite identify. Sarah arrived first, pulling into the driveway of the house where she'd grown up. She found her father in the garage sitting on an old workbench holding a photograph she'd never seen before. It was old, faded, the edges worn. It showed a group of young soldiers, thin and dirty and exhausted looking, standing in front of a gate. The sign above the gate, visible even in the old photograph, said, "Arbeit macht frei." Work sets you free. Sarah recognized it from history books, from documentaries. It was the gate at Dachau. "Dad?" she said softly. Bob looked up. His eyes were red, like he'd been crying or trying not to. "I need to show you something," he said. "I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago. Something I've been carrying since before you were born." They went inside. Michael arrived an hour later, and the family gathered in the kitchen. Helen made coffee, her hands steady, but her face tense, knowing what was coming, having heard a brief version from Bob the night before. They sat around the kitchen table, the same table where they'd eaten thousands of meals, where Bob had helped with homework and carved Thanksgiving turkeys and celebrated birthdays and pretended everything was fine, that he was fine, that the war hadn't broken something fundamental inside him. Bob started talking. His voice was quiet at first, hesitant, like he was feeling his way through unfamiliar territory. He told them about the war, about enlisting after Pearl Harbor, about training and shipping out. He told them about the fighting in Italy and France, about the friends he'd made and lost, about the fear and exhaustion and occasional moments of dark humor that kept them sane. He told them about April 1945, about pushing into Bavaria, about the rumors of camps. Then he told them about April 29th, about the smell that hit them first, about the train with its cargo of corpses, bodies piled like garbage, people who'd died of starvation and thirst and suffocation. Sarah's hand went to her mouth. Michael sat very still, his face pale, his engineer's mind trying to process information that didn't fit into any rational framework. Bob kept talking. He told them about entering the camp, about the skeletal prisoners who were more dead than alive, about the barracks filled with disease and death, about the piles of bodies near the crematoria. He told them about the ovens, about the industrial efficiency of murder, about the systematic dehumanization and destruction of human beings. He told them about feeling helpless and horrified and enraged all at once. Then he told them about the SS guards in the courtyard, about the 50 men who'd been captured, who'd surrendered, who should have been protected as prisoners of war. He told them about the blonde guard with the smirk, about the arrogance and contempt in that young face. He told them about something snapping, about the gunfire, about raising his own rifle, about aiming, about firing, about watching a man die, about knowing it was wrong but not being able to stop, not wanting to stop, about killing a prisoner, an unarmed man, in cold blood. When he finished, the kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the hum of the refrigerator. Sarah was crying, tears streaming down her face. Michael looked stunned, like he'd been hit with something heavy. Helen had tears running down her face too, even though she'd heard a version of this the night before. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah spoke, her voice shaking. "Dad," she said, "you were in an impossible situation. You'd just seen the worst thing human beings can do to each other. I can't even imagine. I don't think anyone who wasn't there can imagine. What you did was wrong, but it was also understandable. You're not a bad person. You're a good man who did something terrible in the worst circumstances imaginable. Bob shook his head. That doesn't make it right, he said. Those men were prisoners. They'd surrendered. Under the rules of war, under everything we're supposed to stand for, they should have been protected. What we did was murder. I murdered that guard. I can call it execution or justice or revenge, but it was murder. And I've carried it for 40 years. Michael leaned forward, his practical engineer's mind working through the problem. Were they the same men who'd been running the camp? He asked. Who'd been killing people? Who'd been operating the ovens and starving the prisoners? Bob nodded. Yes, they were SS, they were camp guards. They were the ones responsible. Then they got what they deserved, Michael said flatly. I'm sorry, but I can't feel bad about Nazis getting killed. Especially Nazis who were running a death camp. Sarah turned to her brother. Michael, you can't say that. Yes, I can, Michael replied, his voice hard. Dad, you've been torturing yourself for 40 years over men who were monsters, who'd been murdering innocent people, including children. Who would have killed you without a second thought if the situation had been reversed? I'm not saying it was right. I'm not saying you should have done it. But I understand why you did it. And I don't think you should feel guilty about it anymore. Bob looked at his son, at this practical, pragmatic man he'd raised. Part of him wanted to accept that absolution, wanted to believe that it was okay, that he'd done what needed to be done. But another part, the part that had lived with this for 4 decades, the part that woke up at 3 a.m. seeing that blonde guard's face, knew it wasn't that simple. I appreciate what you're trying to do, Michael, he said. I really do. But it's not about whether they deserved it. Maybe they did. Maybe they deserved worse. It's about who I became in that moment. It's about crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. We have rules of war for a reason. We don't execute prisoners for a reason. Because once you start doing that, once you decide that some people don't deserve the protection of law or morality or basic human decency, you're on a slippery slope. You're becoming what you're fighting against. I crossed that line. We all did that day. And you can't uncross it. You just have to live with knowing you're capable of it. Sarah reached across the table and took her father's hand in both of hers. Dad, she said, her voice firm despite the tears. You're one of the best men I know. You've been a good father, a good husband, a good person for my entire life. You've been kind and patient and loving. You taught me right from wrong. You taught me to stand up for what's right. What happened at Dachau doesn't change any of that. You were 23 years old in the middle of literal hell. You reacted like a human being, a flawed, traumatized, pushed beyond his limits human being. That doesn't make you a monster. It makes you human. Bob squeezed his daughter's hand, feeling the warmth and strength in her grip. For the first time in 40 years, he felt something like relief washing over him. Not forgiveness. He didn't think he deserved that, didn't think he could forgive himself. But acknowledgement, understanding, acceptance. The burden was still there, would always be there, but it was lighter now, shared among the people he loved most in the world. They talked late into the night, past midnight, past 1 a.m. Bob told them more stories, some dark, some surprisingly funny, filling in the gaps of a life they'd only known in outline. He told them about the friends he'd made in the army, about Johnny Martinez from Texas who could make anyone laugh and died in the Ardennes, about Frank Kowalski from Chicago, who saved Bob's life twice and made it home only to die in a factory accident in 1952. He told them about the fear that was constant, like background noise you learned to tune out but never really went away. He told them about the boredom, the endless waiting and marching and digging foxholes. He told them about the occasional moments of beauty even in war, a sunset over the Italian countryside, a French village celebrating liberation, the kindness of strangers who shared their meager food with hungry soldiers. He told them about coming home and trying to be normal when nothing felt normal anymore, about sitting in church and not being able to pray because he couldn't reconcile a loving God with what he'd seen at Dachau. He told them about loving them and Helen, but always feeling like part of him was still in that courtyard in Bavaria, would always be in that courtyard. He told them about the nightmares, about the blonde guard who visited him almost every night for 40 years. He told them about feeling like a fraud, like everyone thought he was a hero, but he knew he was a murderer. In the weeks that followed, something changed in Bob. The nightmares didn't stop, but they were less frequent, less intense. He seemed more present, more engaged with the world around him. The shadow that had always hung over him seemed lighter somehow. He started talking more openly about the war, not just with family, but with others. When Sarah's school asked if any World War II veterans would come speak to her history students about their experiences, Bob agreed. It was the first time he'd ever done anything like that. He stood in front of 30 high school juniors and told them about Dachau. He didn't spare the details. He told them about the train full of corpses, about the skeletal prisoners, about the piles of bodies. He told them about the horror and rage and helplessness. And then he told them about the courtyard, about what he and his fellow soldiers had done in response to that horror. The classroom was absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. These were 16 and 17-year-olds who'd grown up on video games and action movies, but they weren't prepared for this kind of reality. One kid, a thoughtful-looking boy named David, raised his hand and asked if Bob regretted serving in the war. Bob thought about it for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret serving. I don't regret fighting against the Nazis. Some things are worth fighting for. Evil exists in the world, and sometimes it has to be opposed with force. But I do regret what I did in that courtyard. I regret crossing that line. I regret becoming a killer of helpless men, even evil men. You have to be careful when you're fighting monsters that you don't become a monster yourself. That's the hardest part of war. Not the fear or the danger or the discomfort. It's maintaining your humanity, maintaining your moral compass, when everything around you is pushing you to abandon it." Another student asked how he'd lived with it for so long. Bob looked at Sarah, sitting in the back of the classroom, and smiled sadly. "I didn't live with it very well," he said honestly. "I had nightmares. I pushed people away. I couldn't talk about it. I carried it alone for 40 years, and it almost destroyed me. What saved me was finally telling the truth, finally sharing the burden with people I loved. You can't carry something like that alone. You need help. You need understanding. You need people who love you enough to hear the worst thing about you and still love you." Bob lived another 12 years after that day in the garage when he'd finally told his children the truth. They were good years, maybe the best years of his life in some ways. The nightmares continued but were less frequent. The guilt remained but was more manageable. He spent time with his grandchildren, 4 of them now, and found joy in their innocence and energy. He and Helen traveled a bit, something they'd never done much of, visiting national parks and historical sites. He volunteered at the local VA hospital, talking with younger veterans from Vietnam and the Gulf War, offering the kind of understanding and acceptance he'd needed but never received. He died on a cold January morning in 1997, at home in his bed with Helen and Sarah and Michael at his side. He was 75 years old. His last words were to Sarah. He squeezed her hand with what little strength he had left and said, his voice barely a whisper, "Thank you for understanding. Thank you for letting me tell the truth. Thank you for still loving me." Sarah, tears streaming down her face, leaned down and kissed his forehead and said, "Always, Dad. Always." At his funeral, the VFW gave him full military honors. A color guard, a flag-draped coffin, a rifle salute that made Sarah flinch. Taps played on a bugle. Sarah spoke about her father, about his courage not just in war, but in facing his own demons, in carrying a terrible burden for 40 years and finally finding the strength to share it. She talked about how he'd taught her that being human means being flawed, means making mistakes, means sometimes doing the wrong thing for understandable reasons. She talked about how he'd shown her that real courage isn't being fearless. It's being afraid and carrying on anyway. It's living with guilt and shame and still trying to be a good person. It's telling the truth even when it costs you. Michael read a passage from a letter Bob had written to him a few months before he died. In it, Bob had written in his careful old-fashioned handwriting, "I don't know if what we did at Dachau was right or wrong. I've spent my whole life trying to figure it out, and I still don't have an answer. Maybe there isn't an answer. Maybe some things are too complicated for simple judgments. But I know this. We were human beings pushed to the absolute limit of what humans can endure. We saw evil in its purest form. We saw what happens when humans abandon their humanity, and we broke. Maybe that makes us weak. Maybe that makes us no better than the enemy we were fighting. Or maybe that just makes us human. I choose to believe it makes us human. Flawed, broken, capable of both great good and terrible evil, but human. That's all any of us can be." After the funeral, Sarah and Michael went through their father's things, a task neither of them had been looking forward to. In a box in the attic, Carefully wrapped in cloth and hidden under old blankets, they found more photographs from Dachau. Pictures Bob had taken with a small camera or been given by other soldiers. The train full of corpses, the skeletal prisoners, the barracks, the crematoria, and one photo that made Sarah gasp, a photo of the courtyard after the executions. Bodies on the ground, sprawled in death. Soldiers standing around looking stunned and hollow-eyed. Sarah stared at that photo for a long time, trying to find her father among those young faces, trying to imagine what he'd been feeling in that moment. Michael said quietly, "Should we keep these? Should we do something with them?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "We should. This is part of history. Part of Dad's history. People need to know what happened. All of it. Not just the heroic liberation story, but the complicated, messy, morally ambiguous reality. The horror of the camps and the response of the liberators. It's not a simple story. It's not a comfortable story. But it's a true story. And Dad spent his whole life carrying it alone. Maybe if we share it, if we make sure people know, it'll mean something. It'll honor what he went through." They donated the photos and Bob's letters and the journal he'd kept during the war to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. The museum staff were grateful, said these kinds of personal accounts were invaluable for understanding the full complexity of the liberation. Now they're part of the permanent collection, available to researchers and historians, a testament to what happened at Dachau and to the men who witnessed it and were changed by it. Years later, in 2010, Sarah went to Germany. She was 60 years old, retired from teaching, and she'd always wanted to visit the places her father had been. She went to Dachau. The camp is a memorial now, a museum, preserved as a reminder of what happened there. She walked through the gates her father had walked through 65 years earlier. She saw the barracks, reconstructed but faithful to the originals. She saw the crematoria, preserved exactly as they were. She saw the memorials to the dead, thousands of names carved in stone. She stood in the courtyard where her father had fired his rifle and killed a man. It was peaceful now, quiet except for the murmur of tourists and the click of cameras. Trees grew around the perimeter. Birds sang. The sun was warm. It was hard to imagine it as a place of horror and violence. But Sarah could imagine it differently. She closed her eyes and tried to picture it as it had been. The smell of death and smoke, the skeletal prisoners, the SS guards, the rage and horror of young soldiers who'd seen too much. She could imagine her father, 23 years old, exhausted and traumatized, raising his rifle, making a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She cried for the victims of the camp, for the thousands who'd died there. She cried for the soldiers who'd liberated it and been scarred by what they'd seen. She cried for her father, who'd carried that day with him until he died. Before she left, she placed a small stone on a memorial, following the Jewish tradition of leaving stones rather than flowers. It was for all of them. The murdered, the liberators, the haunted, the human beings caught in the machinery of history, trying to do right and sometimes failing, trying to maintain their humanity in inhuman circumstances. The story of what happened at Dachau on April 29, 1945, is not a simple story. There were heroes that day, unquestionably. The soldiers who liberated the camp, who gave food and water and medical care to the survivors, who bore witness to unimaginable evil and made sure the world would know about it. But there were also men who crossed a line, who executed prisoners, who let rage override discipline and law. Bob Sullivan was both. He was a liberator and an executioner, a hero and a man who committed murder. For 40 years, he couldn't reconcile those two identities, couldn't find a way to be both things at once. But maybe reconciliation isn't the point. Maybe the point is acknowledgement. Understanding that war pushes people to extremes, that good people can do terrible things, that the line between hero and villain is thinner than we'd like to believe. Maybe the point is understanding that carrying the weight of those things, living with guilt and shame and still trying to be a good person, is its own kind of courage. Bob Sullivan walked into Dachau in 1945 as a young soldier from Ohio, who believed in clear distinctions between good and evil, right and wrong. He walked out as something different, something more complicated, a man who'd seen the worst of humanity and responded with the worst of himself, a man who'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. And 40 years later, he finally told his children what that something was. Not a monster, not a hero, Just a man who'd been to hell and somehow found his way back, scarred and broken but still trying, still loving his family, still getting up every morning and trying to be better than the worst thing he'd ever done. If you found this story powerful and thought-provoking, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history that challenge our understanding of war and human nature. Drop a like if this made you think about the moral complexities of combat and the long shadow that war casts over those who fight it. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the impossible choices soldiers face and how we should remember both their heroism and their humanity. History isn't always black and white, and neither are the people who live through it. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth about yourself, even when that truth is uncomfortable.